Okay, so today's session is focused on student expectations of learning and how do we measure up. Now, the first thing is that, just before I really start, it is going to be, I've got lots of pauses for discussion in between. But the first thing is, what is it? And normally it's surveys that's sent out at the end of the course, and it normally includes ratings like a Likert scale for the instructors and the course, and then some open-ended questions to get more feedback. Now, the aim is that it sort of rates specific characteristics of the instructor, like knowledge, fairness, helpfulness, and then on the course sort of organization, difficulty, and informativeness, and also how clear is the instructions, that sort of thing. Then it's basically used to compare teacher effectiveness with ratings received against other professors in the department and the faculty. And that's sort of normally how it's used, is sort of like to benchmark, but then also, to look at individual performance. And in most cases, it feeds into the performance evaluation of the faculty member. And in our case, we're also working on this. Now, my first engagement slide, to the four of you, welcome, Anne, is how do students feel about our student evaluations currently, and how do you feel about student evaluations, or including them in your course? And then kind of what problems do you see with student evaluations? And then I'm going to go into the 3 articles that I sort of looked at to discuss. So let's just quickly get some feedback on this. Anyone? Yes, Ashad.
Okay, so I don't have an answer to the first question, but I can tell you how I feel about our student evaluations, specifically the one we did for digital abilities. I realized that they didn't actually measure students' learning.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, it measured like how they felt about the course.
Okay, cool. Thanks. You actually raise on a very important point that one of the articles address as well, which I'll get into in a bit. Any other feedback?
So I guess I also answered the third question about what problems I see with student evaluations.
Okay, cool. Yes, Moen.
I can't talk about how you feel about it. I can just talk about the principles. And I think it's absolutely critical that we have student evaluations, because it allows us to learn about what our deficiencies are. So that's to answer your point 2. I can't answer your point 1 because I don't know exactly how you have designed your evaluation.
So that's sort of more general question about how students feel about evaluations. And I mean, one of the things that I've picked up over the years is that students don't complete evaluations because they see that, or they don't know how it's being used. So they feel it's a waste of their time because they actually don't see how it's implemented and so forth. And the irony is that is also something that came out of the literature very strongly, that the one article referred to that the same challenges has been coming out for 30 years around we not explaining how it's used, and students not really seeing improvement and so forth. But I'll get into the barriers a bit later. But yeah, so that's what I kind of meant about how.
Well, then that answers question 2. How do we feel about it? Or I mean, question 3. What problems do we see? and that is our explanation and indicating for them that their input improves our input. To answer question 2, it's absolutely critical that any educator knows where he's going wrong or where he's doing well, so he can overall improve what he's trying to put into the program. That's just my tuppence worth. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg and Anne, any feedback from your side?
So maybe from my side, I think part of the problem with the sort of formal evaluations is that they tend to be at the end of the course, where, as you said just now, students don't really care because then, you know, they're moving on, they're looking forward to the next course. And I think that then means that, you know, then as Mervyn was saying, then you can sort of plan for, you know, maybe improvements you want to take in the next iteration. But something that we also need to consider is sort of getting feedback while the course is running, and not just sort of waiting for the sort of end of course evaluation.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And it is something that that we'll discuss a bit later. And Anne, anything from your side?
Nothing from my side. I think everyone's kind of mentioned what my thoughts are.
Okay, cool. So these are the 3 articles that I basically looked at for this, which is students' perception on student evaluations, which is sort of some of the barriers that we already mentioned. But then something else that came out, so student evaluations of teaching encourages poor teaching and contributes to grade inflation. Now, and then this last one is just work that we've done in terms of student evaluations. So how student evaluations are used. So as I mentioned previously, it's used for decision making, for merit increases and promotion, should be used for curriculum, but it should be used for curriculum improvement, for faculty development and professional learning. So it should inform that, and then also for enhancing support and administration processes. Now, the sad thing is that it's normally only a handful of people that receive the evaluations, and one thing that Ashad mentions is it's also not really focused on learning, it's focused on teaching. So the issue is that it's not really being used for that. It's sort of, you look at it and see how you can improve your teaching to put on your e-portfolio. Now, the challenges and barriers that came out was that we've kind of touched on this, is that there's many myths around student evaluations exist, and that also leads to faculty having a reluctance to want to do student evaluations, and then stakeholders are not convinced about its usefulness and validity. And then what came out of the one article was that students reward good grades with positive evaluations. So it's not really about their learning experience or teaching, as if they get good grades, they tend to give a good evaluation, which skews the results. And students reward easy courses with positive evaluations, and students choose courses that promise good grades, and instructors want and need good evaluations because it's obviously tied in with performance. So that yet again skews a bit of the use of evaluations. Now, that is part of the fact that we currently have sort of teaching-centered evaluation systems in place. Now, the second component, or students do not understand how the data are used and are not aware of the effect that feedback might have on improving their learning experience. And the bias is student course evaluations are positively correlated with grades they receive in those courses, which I mentioned above. Now, we've kind of had, like, a lot of that was covered in the beginning. So I just want to quickly touch base again around, are there any additional barriers that you can think of?
Giannis, maybe it's not an additional barrier, maybe just to pick up on one of those points. You know,
Yes.
for example, if you change your teaching methods or strategies, that also can sometimes affect students' evaluations. So, you know, for example, if you're trying more, for example, active learning approaches, getting students to sort of do things before they come to lectures and things like that, students very often push back against those, even though they may be better for learning. But they sometimes feel that if they're just sort of more passive, then they may, at least initially when they sort of those approaches are new, they may give high evaluations for those traditional methods, even though the sort of active learning approaches may be more beneficial for their own learning.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think wasn't this exact discussion at the CLTD conference as well, but I fully agree with you. I think, yeah, because it causes discomfort with the students, even though, like you said, it might lead to better learning. Yeah, so I fully agree with you on that. Any other feedback on barriers or anything else that you want to mention? Okay. So the main thing is, the big problem is that the focus is more on teaching effectiveness rather than on learning. And that we do have a culture of performance that demands metrics. So more and more we do need metrics to make decisions about learning and teaching. So those two are kind of against one another in terms, because I think evaluating learning takes a bit more in-depth understanding as well, compared to just sending out a survey around the end of course evaluations. Like Greg mentioned, we should kind of build a culture of feedback throughout the course. And yet again, that takes more time to build up evidence of how successful the course is. So the next question I have is, how do we reframe student evaluations to make a difference? So if we kind of say that, you know, the current evaluations focus is very teacher centric and doesn't really focus on sort of on what the teacher can provide to the student and on the course structure, rather on whether learning was accomplished. How do we reframe evaluations to make a difference?
That, in my mind, if I may answer that, is actually a catch-22, because it is generally accepted that students are studying to pass exams, and we're not getting across to them that this isn't the object of the exercise, that the exam is just an assessment of how much they have learned, if you understand my thinking.
Yes, no.
So the reframing of the evaluation has to be preceded with trying to change the mindset of the student, that ultimately education is not about exams, but it's about growth.
Yeah.
And we've got to inculcate that culture of wanting to learn and wanting to get better rather than wanting to pass a test. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a very valuable input, because I fully agree with you there. But the challenge is that we sort of what's the word I'm looking for? But we constantly create that culture, because we still, even though what you said is that, you know, assessments drives learning, and they just study to pass a test, yet we constantly continue giving them the same sort of assessments and so forth. So we from our side don't really change the culture of learning, and because we also value, if you look at formative and summative assessment and how many marks we assign to exams and so forth, we kind of instill that behavior in students. Ashad.
So I wanted to add, should maybe the student evaluations be looked at alongside the overall or average course grades, so that there's both a qualitative and quantitative set of data that we can look at. Instead of just looking at the student evaluations, because that could sometimes not give you a clear picture of how the course was designed. But then also, I guess you need to make sure that your assessments are authentic if you're going to look at both alongside each other.
So I definitely agree with you that you need, quantitative and qualitative data. So if you would give a survey, that it would have to have open-ended questions. And I'm going to show an example of one of the surveys that we give that's more focused on learning than teaching, and allowing students to rank the 21st century competencies that they've developed and so forth. So I think there is still a place for a survey. It's just about the type of questions that you asked. But the second component is that, or like if we think about evaluation differently, how can we, like what Greg mentioned, developing a culture of constant feedback? How do we change that? What do we do? Like, what are other ways, and instead of just having one survey at the end of a course? Anyone? Greg, I'm going to pick on. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I was just thinking, so the issue I think students obviously have with evaluations, if I check my evaluations, the ones with this blue, this big system thing going on, most of the students are getting it like right after they've written their test and like in their holidays or during their test time. So I don't think it's the ideal thing to go. But also you're mentioning that it's a lot of it's teacher-centered and not so much the students. And like the whole thing about assessments and stuff, I've been like just as one person in my department that actually cares about, like, wants to do a change. It is like extremely difficult because I think it's going to really come down to like the entire like the faculty of like in itself starting to like push for changes and acknowledging changes, because as like small people ourselves, like just trying to make those differences, we can maybe get like small things in, but like the entire curriculum, like getting like a bottom-up approach to actually getting like a change in the assessments to being more student-centered is like, so is a lot more challenging than if there was started actually becoming coming pressure from the top down.
So I fully agree with you there, but I agree and a little bit of disagree. I do think that we also need to advocate for change in terms of if you implement something specifically and showcase that to the department and tell them what the value is, then there might be incremental growth. Granted, it will take a long time, because it does take a very long time to change systems and processes and culture within an institution, unless it's top down, like you mentioned. But I do think we still have a bit of agency from a bottom up approach to influence these systems. Yes, Merwin.
So then my thinking based on what Anne has put in is we need to find out not what the students got from the course, but what they need from the course, so that we have a better idea of how well we have focused them. Does that sound very vague?
No.
And that should be done maybe midway through any rotation. What did you get out of this? Is not the right way to deal with it. In my brain, we've got to ask them, what do you need that we haven't given you, so that we can learn, if they're being realistic, and if not, we can correct it. And if they are being realistic, then we can find out where we haven't touched base with them, because they not emphasize the things that we believe are important. And then we can deal with it not as a teaching exercise of the discipline, but as a learning exercise. That's just my perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, and I think that's an incredibly valuable perspective, and it is something that I'm yet again going to touch on in one of the future slides. I'm not going to say too much about that. Any last thoughts before I move on? Okay. So, Mervyn, this comes down to what you just said about recognizing the student journey and understanding the student needs. And the learning journey is around three components, which is administration, learning, and support. And looking at, in our curricula, how do we deal with administrative processes and build in support, whether, like, if we take the NMFC program, psychosocial, IT support for students that don't have that, and then obviously academic support and so forth. And then looking at how we do learning. So is there constructive alignment that we don't overwhelm our students? What I mean about constructive alignment is also alignment to notional hours. And the types of assessment we give them and so forth, because all three of those components make up the student journey. And if students have a bad experience with administrative processes, it will frustrate them and also decrease their motivation in the course. So those three really go hand in hand in terms of forming the student experience, both at program level, but also at course level. So when we think about our course evaluations, we also need to think around those three components to see where the students felt supported in the course, and whether they were okay with the administrative processes and not frustrated and so forth. And that's where we need to identify the student needs, which you outlined. Okay. So my next question is, so if we consider those three components, and we think about doing it differently. So one, creating a continuous culture, like what components can we implement to start, first of all, understanding student needs, like you outlined, because I think having multiple touch points along the student journey is important, but starting with understanding student needs, and then at the end, an evaluation. What can we do? So what approaches can we take to evaluate student learning? Anyone?
So I think one of the things we can do is maybe, in terms of sort of our approach, is maybe, at the start of a module or rotation or whatever it is, talk a little bit about, why we do student evaluations, and have a chance for students to discuss what their needs are at that point. What you could also do maybe is sort of say, last time when I did this course or whatever it is, students gave me this feedback, and so this is what I've changed in the course this time when I'm running it with you, and maybe I'd like some feedback about how you think that's going to go. So maybe that's the one thing that I was thinking about, sort of in terms of changing our approach. I think the other thing relates to, I think what Anne said earlier is the timing. So sort of think about when we do our evaluations, not to do them sort of once students have finished their exams or when they're on a break or something like that.
So I actually also wanted to comment on what Anne said around timing. I think that's incredibly important. But what you also mentioned, I really like your idea, and it's maybe something that I'm going to do in the next iteration of feedback, is building that component. This is what the feedback that we got last time, and this is how we addressed it. So what is the new, the new approach or what challenge do you currently have? Because Ashad and I had a discussion a while back about quality, and that the quality actually constantly shifts as you improve it, because people's expectations then also shift. And but yeah, I think part of telling them that you've done something means that they would also be more inclined to give you feedback, because as I mentioned in the beginning, that one of the barriers is that students don't want to waste their time filling in a survey if they don't see how it was addressed. So I really like that consideration. The other thing that you just made me think about is in health system science, we end off with a session on giving appreciative inquiry and giving and evaluation. So the process of QA, and we kind of explain to them why that's important, and then we ask them as sort of as an assessment using or not assessment, but to practice it using what you've learned about appreciative inquiry and quality assurance. Fill in the survey to test and give some feedback on that, and that tends to work really well as well. Any other suggestions?
Question, and I'm sure you're going to discuss it, but this is probably for my benefit. Are written assessments as valuable as interpersonal assessments in terms of, for argument's sake, having a viva as opposed to doing an essay or multiple choice examination? Thanks.
Sorry, just ask your question again. Is written assessments as valuable as a viva?
Well, to do a written assessment, we're getting them to answer questions that we've asked. Whereas in a viva, we actually can judge how they're responding, and based on that response, modify our inquiry or our asking or our communication to explore whether they actually understand and how they're applying their knowledge, as opposed to just ticking off answers. So for me, an interpersonal evaluation is much better than just ticking boxes on an MCQ. Thanks.
So I fully agree with you there, and that's actually going to take me to the next slide, because I quickly want to touch on something that you mentioned. And
sorry, I just want to say to everybody that I haven't seen your slides, but I seem to be anticipating.
So we started a student curriculum review team, which I'll explain in a bit. But one of the things that came out from the student curriculum review team, Merwin, was we were speaking about assessment. Now, the whole idea of a student curriculum review team, and maybe I should quickly go back to that slide before I come back to this one, is that you form a curriculum review team while discussing the ongoing curriculum. So how we basically set it up is that one day a month, we asked students to volunteer. They come in and we take a module on the course and we discuss all the challenges in that module. What do they felt worked well? So what we did is we used current students and students that already passed that year of study, so they went on to the next year of study. And we asked them for feedback about what should we change in the course, what assessments worked, what didn't, and so forth. And the interesting thing that came out from that, Moen, was that the students preferred an oral viva. So alongside the portfolio of learning, we then decided to come up to implement the oral viva as a defense for the portfolio of learning, because the students felt that they've developed enough of the communication skills and presentation skills in order to defend their portfolio. And we've now been running it for 3 years, and it's really worked effectively. And we kind of split it with having a short case study. So we would give them a case study about the health system in Bangkok or Thailand, and then they have to see what will of that would work for the for our health context and so forth. And that way you can really explore their critical thinking and whether they can link that systems thinking. So for the health systems domain, it really works well. And I also think for clinical and so forth, it also works really well. So so the one step, I think the one way of building that culture of feedback, granted it does take a lot of work and effort, is to implement a student curriculum review team, which meets with you and gives you feedback around the value of the specific assessment and whether they felt everything was clear. The great thing about that is that we've also noticed with that it really does equalize the power dynamics and increases motivations, because students feel, even though not all students were part of it, that they co-create this curriculum, that it's not just us dictating what goes into the curriculum. So that is the one approach. The other thing, Merwin, that you alluded to that I just wanted to mention on where we could pick up the quality of the course is also student reflection. So ending off with writing a reflective essay about the student learning in the course, and then looking for, what worked and what didn't work within the reflective essays, and we do pick that up really well in that, although we also have another process which I'm going to speak to in a bit that really helps us unpack what challenges there are. So back to this slide, we implement a SWOT analysis at the end of the course, which I'll explain in a bit. Then surveys focus on learning experience rather than on teaching. So we ask very little of a few questions on, how did you find the lecture and so forth, because what the one article mentioned as well is what came out is that that there's bias in terms of how a person speaks, gender, and so forth. So there's a lot of underlying issues with student evaluation, so much so that they said that it could actually not be used for performance evaluation. And they mentioned a case with one of the universities where they could actually take the university to court for the fact that the evaluations are skewed. So reading through that, it was actually very interesting to see how many levels of bias could there be in a student evaluation, which doesn't really make it fit for performance evaluation, basically. But if we reshift the survey to focus on the learning experience and asking what competencies students developed or felt they developed, So if I go to one of my first slides, I don't know if you can see so that the bottom one is we listed the 21st century competencies, and we asked students to select. So if they felt they didn't, develop any of those, they didn't have to click any. And students felt that they developed leadership and so forth. So that kind of, in terms of our alignment with our HSS competencies, it kind of showed us that we are doing what we are setting out to do. So everything in our survey is sort of focused on learning. Okay, the next one that is create a culture of consistent feedback. Now, there I don't really have a entire an approach to actually give advice of how to create that. But one of the ways that we used, and it worked very well on Sakai, but not so much on Canvas, which is interesting. But it's also because Canvas makes us use, so we have to embed an additional tool to get the feedback. But at the end of each session, we embedded a comments box where we ask students for questions, comments, or feedback. And students were they were constantly giving feedback about sessions that they liked or whether they didn't really understand and so forth. And we could use all of that feedback to enhance those individual sessions. Luckily, about 90% of the feedback was really, was good. But I also really miss that. But so that's kind of one way of doing it. But I also think another way could be to build in reflections and letting students reflect on the course. I mentioned the student curriculum review team, which unfortunately we haven't done it again, and I'll probably do it for the honors program once that launches. And we thought about a bit through the process a bit more. So it is something that provides a lot of insight around making constant curriculum changes. So we actually change as we go along during the year. Because the other thing is that I know it's a lot of work, but the whole idea of this feedback is that you implement it, and for that you kind of constantly need to make changes to the curriculum. It does get less and less every year. So your first few years of making changes, it's really a lot of work, but it is quite important to constantly make changes and to stay up to date. The last component is sort of yet again, Merwin, to what you spoke, and that is the student journey mapping. So mapping out the entire student journey map, or the entire student journey, and then identify the touch points and the pain points. So with regards to learning, administration, and support, so assessments, what are the pain points for assessment in the course and so forth. And then that way you can come up before they start and after, and you can use the same map to just enhance it every year. So like what Greg said was, you fill it in, but then you already showcase the students what was said, and then just add an additional layer to it the next year. And then that way you build a good feedback system about your learning, administration, and support. Now, the last one I want to speak to is the SWOT analysis. Now, this is another thing that we use, and we're also going to run it now with some of the other courses like the digital abilities. And yet again, it's about getting students in a room as a focus group rather than just giving them a survey to fill in, and asking them specific, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in the course. And I have found this as a really valuable exercise. So what I do is that, or what we do is that we select students based on their engagement on the course and based on their performance on the course. So it's quite a mix. So we ask students to volunteer, but we try to keep it small, max 10 students. Funnily enough, I get lots of students to volunteer. I think because they know that we're actually using it. We do get a lot of students to volunteer for this. So last year, I think for the HSS1 course, I had like 50 people that wanted to volunteer, and all I do is I buy them a coffee. And then I actually write a formal report as well on the evaluation. But so we ask them basically around 7 things. Is your experience in this in your experience in this course, what were the strengths, weaknesses, challenges, opportunities around support, layout and structure, assessment, engagement, approach to learning and teaching, authenticity and real-world application, guidance provided, and 8 questions, and administration. Although I haven't done that this year, last year. And what was really interesting about this is we, for example, identified identity issues with the bachelor's in health science students, that they felt that they, like, in a medical degree, students know that they're going to become a doctor and a nurse will become a nurse. The bachelor's of health science students had no idea what they're going to do with their degree. They felt lost, and so the opportunity that we asked them is, what do you want from us? And they said that they want networking events to speak to professionals out there to understand what what is the landscape like, or to do a bit more career exploration. So we built in a session in the 3rd year around exploring careers in this degree program, and we also created an entire list. So some of my team members sat and evaluated all the possible career opportunities, and we provided quite a comprehensive list around that they can then go and explore and find out what that career is about. And yeah, and we're still working on the networking event, so that will happen next year. I'm trying to think what some of the other findings was that was really valuable out of that. Okay, we realized that students were struggling with the administration around booking booking tutors and stuff. So we implemented an Office 365 booking system where they can easily book their tutors and that sort of thing. So the SWOT analysis, I found, is an incredibly valuable approach to evaluate the course, and it really delves into their learning experience rather than whether they like a teacher or not. So I don't think that bias is as is included as much. The other thing is that we try to do this independently, so it's not the lecturer that goes and do it. It's an independent person that sits with them and take them through the questioning. And I think that, so considering what I just mentioned, how would you change your student evaluation process? And that's a question again to discuss. Or how do you think we could change our student evaluation process? Let me quickly look at the chat. Oh. Anyone? Yes, Ashad.
So I think from this session, I've learned that we shouldn't have just one evaluation at the end of the course. It should be at different stages of the course. So I do have a question now. And like you mentioned, for HSS, we have a section for students to provide their feedback after each session. But for some courses, that could be a bit too much. So if we do want to give a student evaluation throughout the course, what would you say would be like the ideal time and the number of times?
So I agree with you that it could be too much. However, the expectation is not there for students. It's to create the space for students to give feedback, but there's not an expectation of giving feedback in every session. And I found that students will only respond to a session if they felt, they really didn't like the session and that it didn't contribute to their learning, or there was something wrong, like they didn't understand the activity requirements and so on. Or on the other hand, if they really liked the session. So the in-betweens, you don't really get feedback. But I think by just having that, it creates the space for students' voices to be heard. With regards to your, and then just the other thing about it is that we kind of spoke about notional hours and not overwhelming students. So I fully agree with you that it should be in a way that it's not too overwhelming, because you still need to kind of consider that as part of the course experience, and should therefore kind of fit within the notional hours of the program. However, we also need feedback in terms of providing it. So it's quite a tricky one to have a balance, and I'm not entirely sure about that yet. It's something that I would, I think, throw it back to everyone else to help you answer that question. Yes, Merwin.
Sorry, I don't mean to be interrupting all the time.
No.
Thinking it's a very complex issue, because by saying a course, you're implying that it's done over a whole year. But during that year, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of the GEMP and the NMFC programs, every 2 months or every 3 months, they're doing a different discipline. And each discipline creates different challenges for them.
Yeah.
And those challenges need to be understood so that they can be met. Just to give a very simple example, the challenges required from a student doing internal medicine are very different from the challenges required from a student doing orthopedics or obstetrics. Just in terms of patient interaction, clinical demands, academic needs. And therefore, we have to adapt our evaluation not to an overall issue, but to the demands of the various disciplines, because they create specific challenges for the students, which are different from discipline to discipline. Does that make any sense to you?
It does, definitely. And I think in addition to that, it's not just the discipline, it's also the different sites. Because I think that's the additional layer of complexity with the medical curriculum is that, yeah, it's also at different sites. And yet again, I'm asking you to go and think about how this could be done And I think it's sort of a trial and error kind of, it's a space where you need to explore a bit and try different things and see what works. Yeah, that's kind of the only thing that I can offer.
The complexity of the different sites just creates a totally impossible dimension, because they're exposed to so many different things at the different sites. Yeah. ONG, for argument's sake, just for example, at Leratong would be very different from ONG at Charlotte.
Yeah.
So how do we put that into our evaluation?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about that a bit in terms of like, if you can kind of have a, like Jeanette Hunter's ideal clinic framework, where you sort of come up with a checklist or a, but it's so difficult to and yeah, to standardize it, because obviously we're not the only stakeholders in, well, I mean, we're teaching, but we're not responsible for maintaining the sites, which adds, so it's a very complex scenario. But I think that made me think about the component of learning excellence, which the student journey mapping, which I'm doing my PhD in exactly this, understanding the student needs of undergraduate medical education, or actually more on GEMP, that at all the different complexities that comes into play, and how do you still standardize the student experience. And the first component is understanding needs, and as you mentioned, the needs would constantly change. So but to still come up with the critical success factors that you need to put into play, that's kind of what, but I cannot give you an answer to that, because there's so many different layers of complexity.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments before we close? Yeah, so in the chat, if you could just sort of mention what is your take-home message from this session, and then I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for a very stimulating session.
Thank you.